My name is McKay Coppins. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine, and very grateful to be here. I'll introduce our panelists in a second. Our panel is going to focus on what young men need and what policymakers can do. So we're going to focus on policy prescriptions in this conversation. Basically, hear from some experts on what policymakers can do to address some of the issues we've been hearing about today. I'll briefly introduce our panelists here. Alex Tarascio is an international pollster and strategist with deep experience advising political parties, NGOs, and democratic institutions. Akash Chougule is president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, think tank focused on expanding economic opportunity for working and lower income Americans. Dr. Taveeshi Gupta is the Director of Research, Evaluation, and Learning at Equimundo. And Gonzalo Schwarz is the founder, President, and CEO of the Archbridge Institute, think tank dedicated to lifting barriers to human flourishing. Like I said, the question that always arises when we have events like this, and I want to thank our sponsors and organizers today for gathering us to address these important issues. But the question that naturally arises is always, what can we actually do about these problems? We all can recognize the problems, and we will talk a little more in detail about what the problems are. But what can policymakers do? If there are people watching this in attendance today, watching the live stream, who want to get thinking about actual policy solutions, where should they start? So I guess we'll actually start with Alex. Could you first just kind of take us through the key findings from your survey of young American men? What surprised you most? Kind of set the table. What are the problems that we should be focusing on when it comes to how men perceive the time they spend online, their job prospects, their relationships?
Sure. So overall, for those of you who weren't here this morning, the men who are online the most, who have no upper limit to how long they spend per day online. So they say they're on for 6 hours or more. That's 27% of the total. That's a ton of people who consume YouTube. Let me rephrase that. Who are on YouTube watching for 6 or more hours a day, who are not going in person with their friends or doing anything social, who never exercise, who are not part of any groups or clubs. They're single, they want a relationship, they're isolating themselves from everything, essentially. They are no religion, and that's not because they are foregoing religion so that they can do other things. They are foregoing religion the same way that they are foregoing everything else. They are self-isolating. They play a ton of video games. Everybody's playing video games in this group. These men play a particularly large amount of video games. These behaviors are correlated very strongly across every answer, every question that we asked. And so that's really consistent. And I'm looking at these behaviors as like flocks of birds kind of moving together. And so one of the things that surprised me was a bird in my flock, I like metaphors, that I didn't expect to see, and that was political independence. And so in a lot of results, Democrats and Republicans, this isn't a political survey, but I want to know how different kinds of groups react to different things. Democrats and Republicans were largely moving together and not at risk. That was not a group that stood out, and you didn't hear it in my earlier presentation because it just didn't come up that much. Independents moved with some of those negative birds in my flock, and so I have a couple of data points on where that came along. And so on mental health, looking at your personal mental health, the Republicans are plus 31. I'm a political guy, and so when I say plus or minus, I mean the positive answers minus the negative. Republicans are plus 31 on mental health. Democrats are plus 20 on mental health. Independents are only plus 5. Okay, male role models, saying that you have a male role model in your life. Republicans are plus 32, Democrats are plus 13, independents plus 2. Independents say that they will figure it out myself at double the rate of what Republicans say, and that's on the question of when you have a crisis in your life, who do you turn to? Your mother, your father, your teammates, friends, etc. The people who say, it was about 17% overall. They say, I don't turn to anyone, I just figure it out myself. Republicans, 10% of them figured out themselves. Democrats, 15%. Independents, 21%. Republicans and Democrats each had 31% of people who were not involved with any organized group. That was one of the more potent predictors of negative results here. With independents, 49% are not part of any organized social group. And so that's fraternities, that's a congregation, that's even like an online community. That could be a subreddit. We wrote these to be intentionally really, really broad. We're not trying to make it a high bar for what it means to be an organized group. It's just anything they consider organized. Independents use AI less than Republicans and Democrats. They gamble less. Specifically, independents over-index on never engaging in online sports betting, which I now see as a social activity based on these results. I was not predisposed to see that beforehand, but in my flocks of birds, either negative or positive, sports betting was more correlated with the positive answers than the negative ones. Same for AI. Didn't have any reason to think that that would be the case in these results, but it was here. They are also, independents, less fraternity affiliated and less likely to agree to, I think, the pretty simple proposition that being part of a male-only group is beneficial. So when I think of the kinds of people that I'm worried about, I'm not worried about the partisans in this. I mean, we greenlit this project a little bit after the Charlie Kirk assassination, and everybody's worried about how hyperpartisanship might create more political violence. I don't think it's the hyperpartisans who are going to be causing political violence. I think it's going to be these really disengaged young men who are more likely to be independents. By the way, 36% of this population is independent, the highest of any political affiliation. And they are just disengaged from everything in society. And so that was one of my biggest surprises. I had no reason to think that would be the case coming in.
That's really fascinating. It gets at this idea that we've heard a lot about of politics increasingly taking the place of other, civic groups, religious groups that used to kind of provide that social anchor, right? I'm curious, Dr. Gupta, in your research on gender norms, expectations around masculinity, how do these findings align with what you study and what you spend a lot of time thinking about?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, first of all, really fascinating findings. And while we don't study the same trends specifically, I think the theme that we've been hearing about since the morning is that we are seeing men experience disconnection, isolation, a sense of loneliness, right? In the morning, the epidemic of loneliness was evoked, and we're seeing something similar. We did a survey back in March of 2025 with 2,500 people in the US. 1,900 were men, rest were women, between the ages of 18 to 45, right? So looking at young people. And what we found was, and I'll tell you the men's results, but the women's results are very similar. 47% of the men said, my interests are not shared by those around me. And so this kind of really sense of, I actually don't think anybody knows me. 53% said, no one really knows me well. 48% said that I keep parts of myself hidden, right? And these have tremendous mental health implications. So the more they say, men, that no one really knows me well, they are twice as likely to report having suicidal thoughts in the past 2 weeks. For women, it's actually worse. When they say that no one really knows me well, they are 3.4 times more likely to have suicidal thoughts, right? So recognizing that these trends exist for both men and women. The other thing that we found, and we heard this a little bit in the morning, is that the youngest group is most pessimistic when it comes to their future prospect of romantic life. So almost 1/3 said that I don't think anyone is going to fall in love with me. And this is the highest for the 18 to the 24-year-old group. And that's really, really hard to actually hear. And I know that we've been sort of hearing about this, but if you think about what that means, like on the ground, it's essentially saying that these people don't think they're going to have those very value systems that we've been talking about, family, marriage, etc. What we also found, and I think you've sort of talked about this, Alex, is how much time young people are spending online. And so we see something similar, right? We know young men and boys are spending a ton of their time online, but I think it's really important for us to nuance that a little bit, right? So I think it was already alluded to in previous panels, not everything online is terrifying, scary, and dangerous. And so I think going in with that prohibition idea, like we should stop people from being online, is not going to work. And we already kind of said that earlier as well. We have a statistic, it's not ours, but it takes 23 minutes for a boy or a man to get online to finally get the algorithm to feed them something dangerous. 23 minutes. That's terrifying. It means we have 22 minutes to do something right, to shift them, to redirect them into slightly more healthier content. I was listening to somebody else the other day and they said boys go on for a protein shake recipe and they end up in the darkest, deepest corners of the internet. So we need to recognize the roles that these systems and algorithms are playing, right? And that boys and men are not inherently violent and dangerous. They don't wake up in the morning and say, I'm gonna go and find the most horrible thing on the internet to watch today. The other interesting thing that I think that's really important for us, at least at Equimundo, is that we enter this space to say, let's hold boys and men accountable, but let's also enter this space with care and compassion, right? That we also sort of look at boys and men as humans, as everything they can be. There's a fantastic primatologist, her name is Sarah Hurdy. She did this incredible study, and she has a book that came out in 2008 called Mothers and Others. What she found was, across all the species that we have been as humans, we're Homo sapiens, right? Before that, there were lots of other sort of species. The reasons why Homo sapiens survived is because of our ability to have empathy and care. And so something that we are finding consistently, globally and domestically in the US is that care is the key to unlock if we want to actually achieve the solutions that we want to achieve. And I can talk more about that later.
Akash, we were actually talking about this a little in the green room before we came out here, but I'm fascinated by this observation that young men are often going online for protein shakes or sports scores or whatever, for kind of benign things, and then ending up in these kind of radicalizing rabbit holes, right? To what extent do you think that we should be paying attention to the algorithms that are pulling people into really dark places, and is there a policy prescription that can address it?
Yeah, so to me, it sounds a little bit more like the symptom than the cause, which is not to say that we shouldn't be thinking about it, right? But that is a downstream impact of what is leading young men to seek out those things, and then of course the algorithm helps them end up there. To me, it's a little bit more of what is the starting point of where young men are, and I think at some level, young men have sort of a clean slate from which to start, right? And everyone is in charge of their own agency and so forth. But I do think that there's a couple things that I keep in mind when I'm thinking of sort of the policy landscape here. One is simply that the obvious point that there is no silver bullet, right? There is no one policy that's going to rescue young American men. The other is the do no harm principle, right? And I come from sort of a limited government principle. And when I say do no harm, I don't mean that there's nothing government can proactively do. What I mean is that there are probably things government is currently doing that are demonstrably harming young men. I think you can look at things like marriage penalties, right? I think you can look at things like workforce development policy, right? We spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars on education and higher education, right? Do men that are not going to college have the same ability to access those funds and use them for upward career trajectory and so forth? There's a lot of really minute policy issues that don't seem like they are specifically pertaining to young American men that would disproportionately benefit young American men, and in particular, men that are non-college. I think the one other thing that I would point to, and it takes me back to something Arthur Brooks used to talk about when he was president of the American Enterprise Institute, was that the four things anybody needs to be happy, but I think this is particularly true of young American men, that I think Dr. Gupta alluded to, are faith, family, community, and work. Those four things are what gives somebody dignity, purpose, happiness, and so on. I think you can probably run through a list of public policy issue areas and decide for yourself, one, is government actively inhibiting people's pursuit and access to these things? And then the other is, are our mainstream elite institutions favorable or unfavorable to these things? And again, I don't necessarily think that there is a policy answer to fixing our elite institutions and how welcoming they are to young men, but to the extent that policy is pushing them in another direction, that's a place I think that policymakers should think very proactively about.
Gonzalo, your institute focuses specifically on this idea of human flourishing, right? And when we look at this survey data that Alex was talking about, it's clear that there are major barriers preventing young men from living meaningful, connected lives, right? And I'm curious, from your research and your perspective, what are those chief barriers for young men? And how should policymakers be thinking about that?
Well, thank you very much for for the question. I'll first, I think, say that I think what has been what we've been discussing throughout the day is that sources of meaning, the traditional sources of meaning, are in decline. That we don't see as many people engaging in religion or family structure or other issues. And I'm going to change a little bit what I was going to say at this point in terms of the political implications, in the sense that I thought, and I still think in a way, that because the sources of meaning are in decline, the people are finding their meaning in politics. And that, in a way, is also a problem because it leads to maybe more polarization, more infighting. But as we just heard in the survey, those groups are actually feel that they're doing better off, or that they have more meaning. So maybe that's not that much of an issue, because in a way, people are still identified with some sort of meaning in their life because of those politics. So maybe that's better than nothing, but I think because of that decline in traditional sources of meaning, and it's not to give a recipe, but it's just those have been traditionally the sources that people, sorry.
No. I just want to pause on that
Yeah.
that thought, because that's the thing that I'm going to be leaving this conversation thinking about. It does matter where the meaning comes from, though, right?
For
because
sure.
as
Yeah.
important as it is that young men have a sense of meaning, you can get meaning from some pretty dangerous sources as well as good sources. So, I'm just wondering if we should be thinking about how to channel that energy in more constructive directions. But anyway,
Yeah,
sorry.
no, for sure. And one of the things that we do at the Institute, and I'll go through some of the other barriers and things that we discussed, but one of the things that we do in terms of what we think of the culture of human flourishing, in the US, I think it's represented more by discussions of the American dream. And the American dream is sort of that human flourishing in the American context, in the US context, in terms of people are trying to live better, richer, and fuller lives. And when we ask people what do they think is essential to the American dream, and it includes men, it includes young ages, people younger as well as old, people, when we ask them what's essential, important but not essential, or not important, freedom of choice on how to live and having a good family life usually rank the highest in terms of what the people relate to as essential. So those two are the best. Retiring comfortably is the third. Owning a house or becoming wealthy is not as essential to people, but I think they're trying to, if we extrapolate that to the source of meaning that we see in American society, it is that freedom of choice on how to live and having a good family life that could be sort of traditional sources of meaning as well. So the appetite, even in the young, is there to find these as the main sources of meaning. How we think about it in terms of, so we think about three sort of interrelated pillars in our work: the economics, and the psychology, and culture of human flourishing. And on the economic side, we discuss a lot of the things that we've discussed here in terms of what are the main barriers or leading indicators to upward mobility. So what could be those barriers? So we have an index that ranks all 50 states around what states have the best environment. Usually our conversations around income mobility or inequality even is that where do we see more or less, but nothing about what are the underlying factors. So we try to talk about four big pillars in terms of entrepreneurship and economic growth, because as we discussed, job creation and jobs are I think the main source of how do people climb the income ladder. That's the main source of income. So we have enough of that in these different states or in our societies. And then we have rule of law in institutions. We have social capital, as what we discussed as well today, and education and skills development. So those are sort of the four big pillars, and there's a lot of indicators, 45 of them, that we go into all of this. So I'm not going to go into all of that, but how we distinguish it in our discussions is artificial and natural barriers. So artificial barriers are something that's externally imposed. So what Akash was saying, I think, is correct in terms of, for example, marriage penalties or benefit cliffs when people, in terms of family formation and family structure. If we have those in place, and then we disincentivize people forming those family structures that are then affecting young men or young women or kids, because in that household is a lot of where what people learn early in life and later in life, how to pursue a good life. Right, so if we disincentivize that, it's an artificial barrier that we can fix. But how do we have better families and family structure? That's in a way a natural barrier that there's not a lot of policy solutions to that. How do we mandate better family or family life? And in that sense, we have to meet people where they are. So a lot of these things are in the community, or learning from others and mentors and all that. And then just the psychology part, we can have no barriers in our way to climb the income ladder or to find fulfillment, but if we feel like a lot of the issues that we're discussing today, loneliness, if we don't have that meaning and purpose in our lives, if we don't feel we have agency to take action to pursue that meaning, we won't get anywhere, regardless if we have no barriers like that are artificially imposed. And The last thing that I would say is in terms of the cultural narratives, and maybe this is where we can do also something in terms of what are the cultural narratives that are dominating our discourse in media, in politics, in just our daily lives. That is, I think there's too much, I think, nihilism and pessimism around some of the main issues and questions. Like even maybe in this discussion, as Akash was saying, I think correctly, in terms of we need to have that agency and sense of responsibility that it's more of a symptom than a problem sometimes if we use too much social media or online too much. The main thing is that we have the agency to take action. If we think that everything and everyone is against us, there's nothing you can do because the algorithms dominate us or these companies are out to get us, you won't feel encouraged to take action in terms of doing something else. But so when people feel sort of attacked because it's our politics are going to destroy us, it's climate change is going to destroy us, all these problems, we become more defense-oriented. And we become defense-oriented, we become more inward-looking, we become, we don't interact with the world, and it's a more fight or flight response. And that inhibits risk-taking, inhibits entrepreneurship, and what's the best way to engage in entrepreneurship is being an entrepreneur of our own lives, having that agency to go out there. So if we feel under threat, we don't engage in growth mindset or growth-oriented ways to go out there. So I think, but a lot of that is due to the narratives and things that we see on media, in politicians, left or right. I think it's not nonpartisan in that sense, that everyone's trying to sell us what's their recipe, and in that sense, they're just pushing us more into that more divisive and negative framework, and that's something that we can work on.
Dr. Gupta, I saw you nodding along. Did you have something to add there?
Well, one of the things I think you provoked this idea of where do people find meaning, because that's important, right? And I think I alluded to the idea of care, and maybe now I can just get a minute to explicate that a little bit. We have studied men who care, men as caregivers, fathers, care for their parents, spouses, somebody with an illness, disability, all over the world. We've been doing this for 20 plus years. And we have yet to come across men who say, I don't like being a carer. We've actually come across men who say caring for my children is more enjoyable than exhausting, right? Men who love being fathers. And it feels so I've been doing this also myself for 15 years. There's been a shift in the way in which we talk about men and care.
Yeah.
Fathers are willing to stand up and say, I love caring for my kid. I want to go home and be there for my child. And we've had panelists say this right on this today itself in the symposium. And what we find, and this is interesting because I think, Alex, your findings are a little bit there. Care is a bipartisan phenomena, right? And so what we're finding is men love to care. It doesn't matter what their political leanings are. And care gives them a sense of purpose. And so when we compared men who are fathers to men who are not fathers, we found that their sense of purpose in life is 1.5 times more. Not to say that men who don't have children don't have a sense of purpose, but to understand this is where meaning matters. This is where they get actually meaning. And there's so much policy can do to address that because it's a bipartisan issue. We ask men, would you vote for politicians if they put care on the agenda? And they're like, yes. It's like a resounding yes globally. So I really think that that's something we need to lean into as well, because that's part of the care, compassionate man, the human qualities that we want to promote. I'll stop.
I want to ask about mental health for a minute, because one thing that seems really clear from these findings is that mental health is a huge issue for young men. We heard in a panel earlier today about the kind of psychological and social barriers to young men seeking out mental health care when they need it, right? I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts on whether there is a policy prescription to enhancing access to or even incentivizing the seeking out of mental health care for young men, which clearly, at least in some cases, could help them, but is not happening to the degree that it needs to.
I can give you a roundabout answer to your question. It does answer you, I promise. Okay. But it's not the starting point that you might assume. We had a question in here on what's your personal top priority for every man that we asked. We always do that for a political top priority. That's where you get inflation, the economy, et cetera. For this, we had a different set of answers. And the top two were financial stability and then mental health. And collectively, that made up about half of the total answers. And so those were far and away the largest responses. There was another one, which was career stability, it was a career or job advancement. And that's what made me hone in on these results, because I wondered what kind of a person says they care about career advancement versus financial stability, because you could consider those to be kind of the same thing, and I don't want to give too many options as a pollster either. I want to narrow things down. But they were really different kinds of people. And so I split up the two groups, and so there were those two answers and then everything else, and I'll tell you what everything else was. And there were big differences between the kinds of people that chose each category. And so for the financial stability and mental health people, about half, those people, 43% of them said that their life was going in the direction that they thought that it would. Overall, 50% of men said that. And so a majority of those people said their life is not going the way that they want. I think that's because if you choose those answers, you perceive that you're being acted upon more by the world. That you want stability because you are unstable, because you want something to be going well. If you say mental health is your top priority, it's probably not because you have great mental health. It's because something is going wrong in your life. The other categories were really different, but in the same way. So our other choices were career or job advancement, education or academic success, physical health, family responsibilities and connection, romantic relationships, social life, or friendships. Every one of those options involves choices that men get to make. They have to do something to be part of each of those. Job advancement means you're gonna work late. You're gonna take a sacrifice from other things you wanna do to stay late at the office to do well at your job. Romantic relationships means probably you're pursuing romantic relationships. Physical health means you care about working out. You wanna do that. Every one of those options is associated with a choice a man gets to make. There's agency there. And so I wasn't surprised when I grouped all of those collectively up, that those people, if you simply picked one of those answers as your top priority, 56% of those people said that their life is going the direction that they planned. And so as a political pollster, I look at the swing between the two different groups. For the people who say financial stability, mental health, to that second group, it's a 26-point swing in saying that your life is going the way that you expect it. And so the way that I answer this question is that I think that access to mental health and like help for men that feel adrift, I think that's actually the wrong way to think about a solution to the problem. I think that men who find responsibilities, if we could point men toward things to do, not toward help that they need, but responsibilities, burdens to give them, or that they can't be given them, burdens that they need to assume, that is actually the solution. And I don't think that would surprise anybody in here, really. I think that's kind of intuitive. That's just how men are really wired. That's a harder problem.
Yeah.
I don't know that that's an easy policy prescription, but I think that pointing them more toward help, that may not get us the result that we want.
The men that I know who, the hardest time that they've had in mental health was during COVID, especially during those early months when everyone was locked down. And when you have too much idle time and not a clear direction you're working toward, not something, a project you're on, new responsibilities, you can get in your own head, you become neurotic, you become obsessive over unhealthy things. And so there's clear wisdom there. Akash, I see you nodding along.
Yeah. I mean, these findings from Alex are so fascinating, and it underscores a point that we've made earlier, which is the importance of agency and feeling like you have control over your own life. And I think the one other thing it makes me think of are the role models who can demonstrate that, who can, one, demonstrate that for you, and then two, also play a role in doing what Alex is talking about, which is presenting young men with challenges to address and people to take care of, and like how to become a productive member of society, right? And both demonstrating it and creating opportunities for them to do so. And again, it probably varies within several different subsections of young American men. And I think the policy answer is probably somewhat limited, but I do think that, when you look at things like the rates of fatherlessness, right, out of wedlock childbirth, et cetera, we've begun to look into some of these questions at FREOPP. And I'll give you a good example. There's something folks might be familiar with here called the success sequence, which is basically if you do these three things in order, if you graduate from high school, get a job, and get married before having kids, the poverty rate of people that do those three things in order is like less than 3%, right? You are all but guaranteed to enter into the middle class. Now again, economic upward mobility and economic prosperity are not the be-all, end-all, and they certainly are not the only answer to some of these problems, but we know that people who are of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to have some of these problems. However, that then, the policy conversations around taking those steps gets into questions that, quite frankly, even in the circles that I'm in and some of the Gonzalo's in, they create uncomfortable conversations, right? It's very easy and comfortable to talk about policies that facilitate upward mobility. It's a very different thing to have conversations about policies that discourage out of wedlock childbirth, that encourage marriage, and so on and so forth. And again, I'm not a proponent of government kind of putting its weight on the scale in one way or another, but at the very least, I do think it involves policymakers making value judgments, and that includes people who are of a limited government sort of philosophy like I am. It is okay and it's important, it's badly necessary, clearly, to make definitive value judgments that certain life choices are better for you than others, and therefore government should do everything it can not to discourage you from making bad choices, and where appropriate should be guiding you towards good ones, because again, it has return on investment, so to speak, from an individual level, a community level, and a national sort of civic level as well.
All right. We have about 5 minutes left until we go to the Q&A, and so I'm going to ask each of you to keep your answers to this brief, but I want to ask each one of you, if you were appointed czar of young American men, and we could gather all the most influential policymakers in Washington in this room right here, and you could tell them, here's one policy to implement that will help address the problems we've been talking about today. And it won't be the silver bullet, as Akash said, there's not one policy answer, but if you could pick one, what would it be? And Alex, we'll start with you.
Gosh, that's terribly unfair. I've really tried to avoid giving any real
I've
policy,
noticed.
policy
sorry.
prescriptions. I'm a limited government guy. I think I echo a lot of what Akash said. I'm suspicious of government policies and guidance to do that, but men need to be limited. They need to limit themselves in how much time they're spending online. If they could make one change, then that is the change they need to make. Hopefully that's a personal one. I probably wouldn't favor the government policy version of that one, but that's the single best thing you could possibly do.
All right. Dr. Gupta?
I'm not a one-sentence kind of gal, so I'll try my hardest. I think first of all, obviously be driven by evidence, without a doubt. But forgive me, I think you can't have policies without a confluence of other factors. Policy alone is not going to make a difference. You need narrative shift. You need to focus on city-level change. That's where most real transformation is likely to happen. That's what we're doing at Equimundo. You have to unlock funding. You need to unlock funding for content creators who develop healthy content. You need to unlock funding in so many ways and shapes. And you need to start seeing men in their heterogeneity. They're not just men as a singular group. They're adolescents. You got to start young. You got to work with school-going kids. You got to work with men as fathers, as men who are about to get married. So I think there can't be a single policy answer for me. I think it needs to be, you got to bring the policymaker and you have to bring other change makers into the room in order to actually have impact and change. Sorry.
No, but building on that, because I agree, and I'm going to try to do two short things. But the first of all, I think because of that, I think what we need in a way is a mind shift a shift in terms of how we talk about mental health. And one of the things that we try to do through one of executive vice president, Claire Rutledge, is a psychologist. And if I don't get this right, it's my fault. If I get this right, it's obviously all his. But it's a change of how we talk about mental health right now, in which it's self-oriented, it's in the present, and it's more about thinking or feeling instead of action. And what he's proposed is the mental health should be more future-oriented, action-oriented, and outward-oriented, which is what we've been talking about now. And future-oriented, it's like, well, maybe I'm not feeling well now, but I'm not thinking about how I feel now. I'm thinking about the future could be better, and to have hope for the future, and to take this XYZ steps to get there. I need to have outward-facing action in terms of that. So I need to. It's not as you were saying. It's about care. It's about do something first physically in terms of exercise, caring about others, family life, community life. Seek something outside of yourself, and that will give you that meaning and purpose and improve your mental health. And action-oriented, because it has to be something that you do and you take an action, not so much in terms of thinking. And in terms of the policy, maybe I will remove as many barriers to entrepreneurship as possible. What I was liking about the previous panel about labor force participation at a young age, getting kids, and I didn't do it in my own life, and I regret it because I wasn't living here at the time. Also, I wasn't able to work when I was 15 to 17. But those first jobs for kids represent learning soft skills, having mentors in those first jobs, having that friendship in terms of work relationships, things that they will not learn as well later if they start working at 20s, but starting to work earlier in life and removing barriers. in terms of regulation, others for people to be able to start working early, removing barriers for entrepreneurs to create those jobs, I think would be key.
Yeah, I mean, if I were czar for a day, I would immediately catapult role model men into leading positions of mainstream institutions in this country that currently seem very, very hostile to young American men. But I think the subset of that, that's a hyper-national version. There is a localized version of that, which again is what Alex was alluding to, which is that, again, not like mandatory service or something, right? But like we need a lot more role model men to assume that responsibility in their communities, right? Men who are fantastic fathers and husbands and brothers and so on, they're often so busy doing and being those things, there's very little time, very little incentive to invest back in the young men that come behind you that are not your immediate family. And I think there has to be some kind of effort, policy or otherwise, to facilitate that and to make it much, much more easy on a hyper-local level.
That's great. I want to get a few questions from the crowd. We have just a few minutes. Yeah, right. We'll start there. We have a microphone. Just wait for the mic to get to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex, your insight towards the beginning of this about political violence being most likely to be committed by people who aren't particularly ideologically radical and who explicitly identify as independent but are this troubled young man archetype is fascinating. I appreciate that a lot. I'm wondering if you've done any thinking, though, on the politically radicalized and to what degree that intersects with the troubled young man aspect here. Like, to what degree should we expect very right-wing and very left-wing political violence alongside the nihilistic Luigi Mangione stuff?
So after this, I'm going to go and ask my sampling lead what is the incidence rate of politically radicalized people, and he's gonna hit me. So I do polling, and we talk to people, and we want to get them to answer honestly. That's a really difficult question set to get honest answers on. It takes a carefully designed research instrument so that you can get people to actually complete it. Otherwise, it's going to cost a lot of money, it'll take a lot of time, and the kinds of people that will answer all the way through, they won't really be representative of the kinds of people that you want. We actually rewrote this script several times because people on our team were worried that troubled young men just aren't going to be captured in that survey. And so that's one. I think two, I don't want to make the claim that every incident of political violence is going to be committed by a political independent. But I am confident in saying that people that are bought into the system, that pick a political party, they're far more likely to fight it out of the ballot box or even really intense words and not pick up a gun. I think people that have lost faith in the system, that first lose faith in the parties, I think they are more likely to do that.
If I could just chime in there really quickly, I think one of the most concerning things we've seen is the group that Alex is talking about. There's clearly an assumption that they themselves are a political constituency that needs to be captured. I think that is very, very concerning to me. And we were just talking about this in the green room. We just saw this like 5 days ago. The president of the Heritage Foundation felt like he needs to play footsie with Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes, who are just like two of the worst people in political commentary today. Not because I think he actually believes the things that he's hearing, but clearly there's a sense that there is a political constituency to be had there that is necessary to capture in order to be successful in general. That is something that needs to be broken up, again, not by government, right? Not by force or anything like that, but the feeling that disaffected young men who are prone to bad ideas are themselves a political constituency should underscore the seriousness of this problem rather than being coddled.
One more.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I'm Charlie with the Young Men Research Project, which does research and polling on young men in the US. And I'm curious in the survey if you asked about young men's life aspirations. You know, in our own polling, we found home ownership, starting a family, having kids, overwhelmingly at the top. And I'm curious if you could break down a little more based on different demographics, if you found anything striking with that.
I think with this group, it's actually pretty easy because it's pretty young. And so when you look at every age group on a typical poll of like American voters, this age group is 25% married and 75%-ish single. Every other age group is like 66% married. And so within ours, we had 66% who were single And of the total, it was almost 40% who were single but want a relationship. And so far and away, that's the number one aspiration, is that people want a romantic partner. And they, even if they aren't putting themselves in the position to actually get one. Homeownership comes up a lot. Jobs come up a lot. And again, like financial stability, that's really important. Career advancement and aspiration, that's really important. This is an age group that is concerned about graduating from college if they haven't yet. And so there's a lot of those life goals that they are focused on. If I were to look at the entire population, I think you'd see a more evenly distributed set. But for this one, it is in order relationships as the number one, and then I think a mix of career and academic success as the number 2 or 3, depending on the person. Homeownership, frankly, for a 28-year-old, that's the oldest person in this sample. I think for most of them, it feels pretty out of reach. It came up a lot in the verbatims, the open-ended responses, when we asked why their life is or isn't going according to plan. And so there were a lot of people that were disappointed in not being able to buy a house yet. That came up quite a bit.
All right, please join me in thanking our panel.